So we have finished, or kind of finished, talking about the period of enlightenment. And now we're moving into revolution. And we're going to talk about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Latin American Revolution, just briefly, but enough for you to get an idea of it. So, what is revolution? And this is a definition that I would like you to know. So, if you need to jot it down, please do so. But revolution is a forcible overthrow of a government or social order in favor of a new system. It comes from, think about revolving and something ever changing. It's where people are not happy with the way things are being done, whether that be government or any kind of organization. They're not happy with it and they are trying to make a change and create something new. So during the period of enlightenment, people were starting to think and discover for themselves. And they were seeing that the church was telling them one thing, but science was having another, and the monarchs were telling them something, and people kind of were torn between who to believe, and they really started investigating truth and seeking out truth and using scientific inquiry for that. So the Enlightenment encouraged people to start thinking and discovering for themselves, not just taking the word of someone else. And revolutions generally happen when citizens want more rights and freedoms. So during Enlightenment, people are starting to think for themselves, and the government, the monarchs, the church are telling them, you're not allowed to do that. This is what you have to do. And people are starting to say, wait a minute, I can do what I want here. And there is where revolution begins. So we're going to start with the American Revolution. Just a very quick overview of it. But basically, Great Britain had fought in the French and Indian War in the colonies at the time. And they accumulated a lot of debt. A lot of people, it's kind of a misnomer. They think the French and Indian War is French versus Indians, but it's French and Native Americans versus Britain and Native Americans. And in order to pay for this war, Britain decided they were going to start taxing colonists. They have to find some way to make up all that war debt. And they start taxing just about everything they could think of. They also said they were leaving soldiers behind, British soldiers behind in the colonies instead of going back home, because now the colonists would need protection from the natives that had just lost a war. So the soldiers stay behind. These are people that the colonists had been trying to get away from. That's why they started a new colony. And now they're being taxed for things like paper, tea, just sugar, just about anything they could tax, they did. And Britain was even enforcing laws where if a British soldier came to your house and they needed a place to stay, you had to provide them lodging. It was the law. And as they taxed the Americans, or the colonists at the time, because they weren't Americans yet, were starting to say their big motto became taxation without representation. That they're being taxed, but they have no say in the government. They can't make any change because they're not actually in Britain. So all these laws are being passed, but they have nothing to benefit from it. So they signed the Declaration of Independence, which obviously led to the Revolutionary War, which lasted 8 years. So once they won the war, that was kind of a surprise for Britain, to say the least, because this was just a small little group of colonies in the New World. They didn't even have an actual army yet. They had to form their own military in order to fight. But once they won, they had to form a new government. And this created a lot of problems with the founding fathers, because many of them said, nope, just let each state decide what we do. And then some said, no, we need a president who rules until his death. And a lot of founding fathers were against that, because they said, no, we just fought this war to get away from a monarch. And now a president that rules until his death is basically another monarch. And so they were torn with how to set up the government that would benefit everyone and not be too much like a monarchy. They came up with a democratic republic. A straight democracy is where the people vote and majority wins. And a republic is representatives. So a democratic republic means the people elect their representatives who vote on their behalf. So it's the opposite of a monarchy. The people actually had a say. And as they started coming up with their founding documents, they looked to John Locke's two treatises of government. And we talked a little bit about John Locke and Enlightenment, but he basically wrote this document that says that men are naturally free, that people should have rights such as the right to life, liberty, and property, that is something that all men are guaranteed. And our founding fathers used that when they formed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. When they started with the Constitution, there were many people that said, wait. If we're starting a new government, what if they start taking away my rights? And that's where they came up with the Bill of Rights, and we got the freedom of speech, and the freedom of religion, and the right to bear arms. And they even threw in an article there that says that British soldiers or any soldier, an American soldier, cannot demand to stay in your home anymore. It was a direct response to how they had been treated. And then you had Montesquieu, as we talked about during Enlightenment. He believed in a separation of powers, and that is what the American Revolution and their founding documents also use. So they're using these ideas from Enlightenment to form their own documents as they form a new nation, with the idea that men are free, that men have rights, and that a government should have a separation of powers, and no one person should have too much control. So this leads then to the French Revolution. As they have seen the American Revolution play out, people are starting to feel inspired. The French Revolution was not too long after the American Revolution. But you did an activity with this the other day. You had the three estates: the clergy, nobility, and commoners, the average person. And they had unfair taxation. Basically, commoners were typically the poorer people. These were the working class, and they had to pay all the taxes to support France. But clergy and nobility didn't have to pay any taxes. And when you got to vote in assembly, the clergy got one vote, nobility got one vote, commoners got one vote. So even if you think of like a pyramid of 100 people, and 10 of them are clergy, 20 are nobility, and 70 are commoners, those 30 people in clergy and nobility together have a total of 2 votes, and the commoners only had 1. So they were outvoted every time, and they couldn't get their way, and they felt that it was unfair representation. So then you have the Estates Generales that's assembled by King Louis XVI, and it is that the Congress basically where they get together and they have these votes. But the Third Estate broke off, yes, I see that typo, to form the National Assembly. This was more the commoners that they said, no, we're not going to go along with this. We need our own say. And the king really tried to shut that down. He did not like what was happening. He locked the doors. And so these men wandered off to find a place where they could meet. And they met at the tennis courts. They're not like the tennis courts we think of today. And they formed what's called the Tennis Court Oath. And in this document, the men voted, this is a direct quote, not to separate and to reassemble wherever necessary until the constitution of the kingdom is established. So these men got together and decided that they were going to decide how France was to be run from now on. They were going to create a French constitution that didn't need the monarchy. And the king could try and scare them off, but they would meet wherever they could and however needed until they had this constitution in place. So as the revolution continues, you have what's called the Reign of Terror. And so they've basically overthrown the king, and now you have the radicals are led by this guy, Maximilien Robespierre. And he takes over the government, and he's all for revolution. And this was a scary time. If you did not agree with the revolution, or even hinted that you might not agree with the revolution, you could be punished. And they were going around arresting anyone that didn't fall in line with their beliefs. And there were only 2 things that you could be tried. You could be innocent, or punished. And if you were punished, you were put to death. This is the time when the guillotine came around that would behead people. And around 17,000 people were killed during the Reign of Terror. During this time, though, is also when the idea of a citizen is created as part of the French Revolution. So you had active citizens versus passive citizens. Active citizens were white males, and passive citizens were women, slaves, children, foreigners. These are people that live here, but active citizens have rights within the government. Passive citizens do not. So the government's losing power. There's chaos everywhere. You have the Reign of Terror. Nobody really knows what's going on and who's in charge. And Napoleon comes in, Napoleon Bonaparte. And he had worked with the military before, and so he takes over as a dictator and even names himself an emperor. And he was so sure of himself and his abilities that normally the Pope would crown you at your coronation, but he refused to let the Pope crown him. He actually put the crown on his own head. Like he gives himself the power. He doesn't need the church to give him power. He gives himself power to rule all of France. One of the good things that came out of his rule was the Napoleonic Code, and this was the idea prior to his rule. Anyone in government was there because their dad ruled or because of their religion. It was like they had this position within nobility. So you didn't have to know what you were doing. It just had to do with your last name or who you were. And Napoleon came up with the idea that government positions should be appointed based on your qualifications and your ability. You shouldn't just be granted a position because of who your parents were. You have to earn it. But ultimately, he got a little power hungry. Again, he is a dictator, and it led to far more wars and turmoil in France. Then you have the Latin American Revolution. They were inspired by the American Revolution. They saw the colonies fight for their independence from Europe. And again, Latin America and South America were all colonies settled by the British, if you remember, or British, Spanish, Portuguese, if you remember from the Age of Exploration. So all these colonies now decide they want to seek independence from European powers as well. And it starts with Haiti. It's an island in the Caribbean there. And that was really led by a man named Toussaint Louverture. That's this guy over here on the right. And the Haiti Revolution was actually very successful for anti slavery and anti colonial. And it started in the French colony of Saint Dominique from 1791 to 1804. It lasted quite a while. And it kind of began as chaos. It was a lot of wealthy landowners who wanted independence from European colonies or from European powers. And so they were kind of fighting and just doing whatever. And then slaves saw this as a chance. Well, hey, wait, they're trying to get freedom from European powers. We want freedom as well. And there was complete chaos. Slaves were destroying crops and killing masters, and nobody really knew who was in charge or what anyone was really fighting for. And at first, Louverture was like, no, I want nothing to do with this. This is not what I'm about. But then, as he saw potential and he saw a need for a leader, he started organizing the African slaves into armies and trained them on how to properly negotiate with what they want and how to get what they want without just tearing apart the land. And in fact, he claimed the land for himself for a while with freedom, or had gotten freedom and independence. And Napoleon wanted it back. And so he negotiated with Napoleon that Napoleon could have the island or the region as long as all the slaves were freed. And that's exactly what he got. So not only did it help get rid of the colonial powers, but it also freed all the slaves on the island. And then the Colombian Venezuelan Revolution, led by Simon Bolivar. So in 1811, Venezuelans decided to declare their independence. They see it successful everywhere else. They want this as well. But when they did it, it was not as successful. They were actually defeated by the Spanish almost immediately. But Bolivia decided to lead military forces. He was not going to give up. He wanted to make sure that Venezuela got the independence that he craved. And so it's called the Admirable Campaign. And through his campaign and battles and success, he was successful in gaining independence from Spain, and it led to what they call the Second Republic of Venezuela, because the first one was in 1811 and it didn't